Good evening and welcome back to the second lecture of our webinar. In the first lecture, it was pointed out how disability is not a homogeneous category. The experience of disability becomes heterogeneous with the insertion of other variables such as gender, caste, race, class, and so on. In the second lecture, we are going to talk about the intersection of disability with one of these variables, that is gender. We are going to talk about how gender and disability overlap with each other to create a kind of experience that creates a subcategory of experience within the larger category of disabled experience. So to talk about disability and gender, we have with us this evening a very familiar face and a much loved person, Ms. Dr. Shilpa Das, who has been with us last week and has generously agreed to be with us again to talk about gender and disability. Welcome, Shilpa.
Thank you, Professor Sati. Thank you so much. And thank you,
We
Center.
also have with us Dr. Nandini Ghosh, who specializes in the area of gender and disability, and who has graciously agreed to moderate this session. It's over to you, Nandini.
Thank you, Professor Sati. Welcome to all the participants here, and we hope to have a very lively session here by Professor Shilpa Das. So Shilpa is Principal Faculty, Interdisciplinary Design Studies at the National Institute of Design. And since 2017, she has been heading the PhD program and Science and Liberal Arts Studies program since 2004. She is an alumnus of JNU for her MA, Gujarat University for MPhil, and TIS Mumbai for her PhD, where I also did my PhD. So in a way, Shilpa and I share the same institution from where we did our PhDs, and both of us worked on the larger area of gender and disability. So welcome, Shilpa.
Thank you, Nandini.
And we'll have your talk for about an hour, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion.
Thank you so much. So do I begin?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So let me start. Good evening, everyone. And let me start by thanking the Center for Disability Research and Training, Saksham, and also especially Professor Someshwar Sati for inviting me to this conference. Last week at the Center's national seminar, I introduced the key concepts, scholars and their works in disability studies as well as feminist disability studies. In this session, I shall provide a brief overview of studies, including some empirical ones that have dwelt on disability in the context of gender. So now just to, this slide is just so that we are all on the same page. And because disability is a social construct, and thereby it is related to other social constructs such as gender, age, class, caste, religion, and race, and sexuality. So it is through these that are fully integrated selves, what Margaret Price calls body minds, are lived and known. So at this point, let us look at these few definitions. Gender basically refers to the socially constructed roles, responsibilities, behaviors, attributes that a given society or culture attributes to men and women. Now, the term is, of course, today used more broadly to denote a range of identities that do not correspond to established ideas of male or female. And in this session, however, I focus on cis disabled women. So, gender divided societies operate both at the level of culture and structure. Culture, because they involve ideologies and the cultural constructions of gender differences, and structure because and through gender roles, sex gender systems, and gender relations. And in every culture, gendered identities are shaped. So, gender not only determines the status and role of women and men, but it also determines relationships between them. And this is termed gender relations. It refers to the relations of power between women and men, which are revealed in a range of practices, ideas, representations, including the division of labor, roles and resources between them, and ascribing to them of different abilities, attitudes, desires, personality traits, behavioral patterns, and so on. And gender relations may be seen to be largely socially constructed rather than biologically determined, and thus they are innately political. In India's patriarchal socio-cultural fabric, there is a fair play of degree of power play and gender discrimination, which results in differential power, authority, and control over other people, resources, education, healthcare, employment, and also decision making in the arenas of family and society at large. Thus, hegemonic ideologies are produced and they are perpetuated by institutions of socialization that we all grow up in, such as families, schools, the media, and also through symbolic constructs, customs, and religious belief. So then with that, we come to gender stereotypes and what it means to be a man or a woman in a specific context. Let us pay a tribute to Kamla Bhasin, whom we lost a few days back, who's done so much work with respect to gender. And she says that what it means to be a man or a woman in a specific context takes on a normative significance which leads systematically to women's disadvantage and subordination and to gender inequities. And this is a result of what she terms as oppressive paternalistic dominance. And she says it is insidious because it is often not perceived as oppressive. So, male bias prevails throughout the subcontinent, and in the worst scenario, manifests in the form of son preference, female infanticide, and female feticide. And this has deep consequences on the way men and women are perceived and on the opportunities available to women. So, if we just take a look at this particular slide to see how gender discrimination works, the statistics on this slide talk about differences in terms of education levels. And so it says that about 9% among the male disabled literates are graduates, but among female disabled persons, 55% are illiterate. And 9% of the disabled female population has matric or secondary education, but are not graduates, and only 3% are graduates or above. So then we talk about gendered disability, and disability is basically gendered, culturally constituted, and socially negotiated. And gender has emerged as a key site of disability critique in 4 general areas. Okay, so the themes I cover in this session will be subsumed under any of the 4 themes that I am mentioning now. 1, sex impairment and the realness of the body. 2, the medicalization of gender. 3, the mutually reinforcing structures of gender and disability oppression, and 4, the reconfiguration of gender through disability experience. And I thought that this was a very useful distinction that Kim Q Hall, in one of her articles, actually elaborates. So, if disability theorists hope to understand and critique the norms of bodily appearance and body-mind functioning, as well as offer alternative conceptions of the world and being, then there is no way that they don't look at gender structures and how it is structured by those norms. Similarly, feminist and queer theorists also cannot develop adequate accounts of gender without attending to the entanglements of the meaning and materialization of gender and disability. And just as disability theorists have distinguished between impairment and disability, feminist theorists have distinguished between sex and gender. So, sex, as we know, refers to the chromosomal, anatomical, and physiological characteristics that mark the body as male, female, or intersex. And gender refers to what it means to be masculine and thus a man, and feminine and thus a woman. In this picture, those who queer gender norms, such as butches, femmes, trans identified people, and other gender transgressive people, fall under a gender continuum. I do not really specialize in queer gender disability studies. So as I said, my focus is going to be on cis women. Now, feminist and disability theorists have worked diligently to show how gender and disability are socially and culturally produced. In order to combat the naturalization of the category, quote, women, unquote, non-normative gender and disability. And now one consequence of sex, gender and impairment disability distinctions is the fact that sex and impairment both are relegated to the body. Now, some feminist and disability theorists are concerned about the extent to which these dimensions and these distinctions lead to a devaluation of the material body. In some ways, Professor Watson in his lecture earlier touched upon this. In particularly the real physical dimensions of gender and disability. And there are disability scholars who call for a materialist turn in feminism and in feminist disability studies, who say that we need to take the focus away from representation and towards bodily pain and diseases that affect women's real bodies. Now, this, of course, has a corollary in disability discussions about pain and impairment that we had in the first session today. And Tobin Sivers argues for realism about the disabled body that looks at embodied lives and experiences. So there are also others, feminist, queer, and disability theorists who question the assumption that sex and impairment are, mere facts of body materiality. Anyway, gender disability plays a significant part in influencing people's experience of a disabling society, and it affects both men and women. And any account of the lives of disabled people have to incorporate accounts of both. A brief look at their recent historical conceptualizations indicate that both women and disabled are commonly stereotyped, and both are essentialized. And we do not really have to rack our, remember to see some of these stereotypes: passive, weak, burdensome, hypersensitive, deceitful, cunning, demanding, and so on. As we can see, most of these characteristics that you see on the slide exhibit a slope towards extremes, and the disabled female figure is posited as antipodal to the masculine figure and to the non-disabled woman, and is placed both inside and outside the category of woman, says Rosemary Garland Thompson. Now, Upali Chakrabarti, in a very insightful paper, states that the image of disability may be intensified by gender. For women, there is a sense of identified passivity and helplessness. For men, a quote, corrupted, unquote, masculinity generated by enforced dependence. And she says these images have real consequences in terms of education, employment, uh, personal relationships, and so on. And they in turn reinforce images in the public sphere. So the body becomes an important marker of identity for both women and disabled people. And Foucault in 1980 establishes the interrelationship between the body and power. But I'm referring to him in the context of medicalization because he says that, in the so-called training of bodies, the formation of the body reveals itself as an instrument which is essential in the development of human beings. And basically, more importantly and significantly for me, he talks about how the bodies of both women and disabled people are relentlessly subjected to discipline through social practices such as, clitoridectomies, ovariotomies, surgeries for the congenitally disabled, conjoined twins, and so on. And feminists have also rigorously critiqued this medicalization of gender and the heteronormative bias that informs it, because they say it perpetuates gender beliefs. So Kim Q Hall writes that the medical model conceptualizes disability, intersex, and transgender as problems that are in need of cure or elimination. And in the case of intersex, she says cure involves surgical creation of binary sex. In the case of transgender, cure means a sex reassignment surgery to fix what is called gender identity disorder. And both disabled and trans people are stigmatized, a problem that can be addressed by changing dominant beliefs, attitudes, and environments, not by curing, quotes, or eliminating non-normative body minds. So the oppression of disabled women is constituted in their entry in the public world, where they are subject to staring, condescension, pity, and hostility, wrote Jenny Morris as early as 1991. And 6 years later, Garland Thompson termed the medicalization of women and disabled people's bodies as the politics of appearance. In her highly provocative book, Staring, she says that both women and disabled people are reduced to some aspect of their physical presence. And this is, and she says, if the male gaze makes the normative female a sexual spectacle, then the stare sculpts the disabled subject into a grotesque object. And in short, what she says is that the stare is the definitive gesture that constructs disability as an oppressive social relationship because it fixes bodies that are deemed abnormal. And this is what Mitchell later comes along and says is a way to make disability hyper visible. Okay? Even Dr. Anita Ghai writes about this in the Indian context when she says that the stare divests disabled women of any semblance of dignity or resistance. And disabled women are thus placed either in the plane of invisibility or being hyper visible. So if we examine the ladder of hierarchy, then we find that society equates human normality typically with male normality, and much has been written about this, but I need to bring it up here. And female normality is defined on the basis of this norm and is thus a first level of deviance, the female being subordinate and the other to the male. Disabled people are then constructed as the other of the other, and disability is understood to be a deviation from the norm of able body. So being a disabled man is a rung then below the norm of the non-disabled woman, and disabled women would be at the fourth level down. Now, transgender and intersexed people, and especially disabled, would be much lower down. Disabled women face complex forms of discrimination because both the female gender and disability are defined in terms of the body lacking and so on to varying degrees. But also, as we mentioned in the first session, physical impairments themselves have a broad range. So even within the same category, with the same disability, two different people may have completely different experiences in terms of their body. And these impairments are also often hierarchically structured. Some categories considered less acceptable than others. Thus, disabled women form a heterogeneous group, and as a group, they experience many different forms of injustice that interact in complex intersectional ways with other systems of oppression. Now, we talk about the gendered disabled body and bodily experience. So, how do women experience their bodies? They do this through mediations of constructions, associations, and images, which the socio-cultural context upholds. And we know that cultural practices shape and manipulate women's physical bodies and also the lived experience of their bodies, and thus produce the female body. So, South Asian societies are deeply rooted in patriarchal control over women's labor, fertility, and sexuality, oppression within the family and society at large. And women are disenfranchised with limited rights, lack of access to resources, and lack of inheritance rights. So, gender inequalities also result from, ideologically embedded, pre-existing gendered social norms and perceptions, which we have accepted so far. For women, acquiring a socially acceptable body in general and a feminine body in particular becomes a crucial imperative for the presentation of the self. And typically, this is critical to a woman's sense of herself as a female, sexually desiring and desirable subject, as Bartke puts it in 1992. So, the female disablement experience has to be seen as the further marginalization of the already marginal. So if we look at empirical studies in the West, these are on the slide, you see some of the broad themes, and I shall speak about them very quickly, beginning with the earliest kind of themes that came up and issues. One being what Fine and Ash in 1988 called the systematic rolelessness of women. So they made connections between movements, experiences, and among various disciplines like sociology, philosophy, folklore, popular culture, and so on. And they observed that while disabled women experienced a similar but more acute pattern of discrimination to women in general, they experienced this, without being placed on a pedestal of superiority that non-disabled women occupy. And they argued that disabled men have had relatively more opportunities to resist the stigma that is attached to disability. So basically, they brought up for the first time what is called the double disadvantage, and later other people spoke about the triple disadvantage faced by disabled women. So they said that the social oppression of being a woman in a sexist society and being disabled in an ableist society is a double disadvantage. Now, this oppression led to a negative self-image and a systematic rolelessness. They were also the first ones to write about women with hidden disabilities or less obvious impairments. But there are other scholars who came along after Fine and Ash, and like Morris, who critiqued this double disadvantage theory on the grounds that it is an oppressive image in itself that makes victims of disabled women instead of empowered persons. And Morris said that it tends to shift the onus of disability away from non-disabled people and social institutions and their inherent prejudice. And instead, it made passive victims of oppression of disabled women. It denied them any agency and views them as a minority interest. So she says that disabled people's personal experience of prejudice must be made political. Soon there were other studies which captured the nature of social oppression of disabled women. For instance, you have Susan Lonsdale in 1990, who documented the varied social and economic disadvantages faced by disabled women. and how they faced and experienced disadvantages that set them apart from both disabled men and non-disabled women in every sphere, economics, in terms of society and psychologically. And they also explored discrimination in areas like education, employment, and so on, rehabilitation programs, and how women were at a disadvantage. So with that, we move to empirical studies in India. And writing on disability in India at first typically comprised empirical studies on impairment that were located in the medical paradigm and written by clinical psychologists, rehabilitators, and therapists. Okay? And then Usha Bhatt's book in 1963 was the first one that did a detailed analysis of social attitudes towards disability, but it did not strictly have a feminist or a critical disability studies approach. And then there were two books by Chaturvedi and Mani that had dealt with disability from a policy angle. Bakker's work had a disability studies perspective and urged for disability rights legislation. Bakker and Sharma discussed issues related to disability law. And then we had, of course, Davar, Dhanda, and Adlakha, who, and even Dr. Ghai, who focused on psychosocial disability. So they have a disability studies approach, and they span the perspectives of the women's movement, the law, and disability. And then Hans and Patri also in 2003 expressed the same concerns, in their work, but related to our sociocultural context. And this corpus of work is still emerging and needs to grow with more and more disabled women, feminist theorists, and others expressing themselves. So while there are many empirical studies related to specific disabilities and chronic illness narratives, we need more of academic advocacy and theory. Okay, now in India, we know plural identity markers like class, caste, domicile, etc., enmesh to render more complex the discrediting experience of disability for disabled women, for Indian women, and disability is additional to their marginalized gender position, say several reports by many different organizations and NGOs. The International Labour Organization also states that disabled women are at an additional and increased risk of being sicker, poorer, and more socially isolated than either disabled men or non-disabled women. So it translates into, neglect, lack of medical care, less access to food, health resources, especially in rural areas, where also there is a higher mortality rate for disabled girls. And they are taken often to doctors only when things take a serious turn. Women in rural areas are seen to bear, to a larger extent, the brunt of stigma related to disability. And in 2013, Professor Nilika Mehrotra uses an intersectional approach to argue that caste, gender, and disability implicate and impact the access and opportunities available to Dalits with disabilities, and especially Dalit disabled women in the context of the Indian economy. So my last 5-6 slides have a detailed list of references that I have used in this presentation, and you can later refer to that. And then, of course, she gives us facts and figures with respect to Dalit disabled women in the context of the Indian economy. So she says that with an estimated 1.8% people with disabilities in the overall population of India, the prevalence of disability among Dalits is remarkably higher, about 2.4%. But however, she says the gender gap between Dalit disabled men and women and in the scheduled tribes is seen to be relatively lower than other social groups. So when we talk about attitudes towards disabled women in India, then for many women in India, society's attitude towards them seems to be the most harsh aspect of their disability. And then, of course, we know that in India, because there is son preference, and also because it is strengthened by the cultural belief that sons provide security to parents in their old age and provide easy passage into the afterlife. Daughters, in contrast, are considered temporary inhabitants of their natal households who are quickly sent away to their marital homes, to which they thereafter belong. And the notion of women as burdens is also entrenched in the cultural belief that in any way, if you economically invest in girls, such as education, it accrues to the husband and not to the natal family, as opposed to boys, because their education is seen to feed back into the earnings and status of the family. So, in Gujarat, where I live and work, they say Tada rotla ma chokri palwai jashe, which means a girl can survive even on rotis that have gone stale, basically on very, very low resources, very low maintenance. So a girl being born with or acquiring the disability is typically considered to be, as Bakar and Sharma put it, a disaster at worst and liability at best. And this also renders disabled girls victims of discriminatory practice like female infanticide, uh, including in Gujarat, where we were working on a project several years ago. We found such things. And then, of course, what is the onset of disability in daughters is considered to be a fate worse than death. And several of our scholars have written about this, including Rangaswamy, Professor Mehrotra, Professor Ghai, Renu Adlakha, and Shubhangi Vaidya in 2016. So studies reveal that family attitudes also encompass a gamut of emotions ranging from denial, guilt, blame, helplessness, self-mortification, shock, and depression. And typically, the male head of the family takes decisions on important matters pertaining to the children, such as education, healthcare, freedom of movement, and employment, while the mother is the traditional caregiver for all children, including the disabled girl child. So, differential treatment is also often seen in the family, and parents usually fail to perceive the need to provide the disabled daughter with adequate emotional support and psychological care, and several studies express that. Now, women are also, hidden from the outside gaze in many families. I found that in Gujarat, in a project I worked on a few years ago, and left out of family and community activities, especially religious rites and rituals because of social taboos and stigma even today, especially in rural areas. And parents frequently believe that the presence of disabled girl children will thwart or hinder the chances of marriage of their female siblings. Uh, Also, there are instances recorded of them being subjected to name calling, uh, being abandoned, and so on. Then, on the other hand, parents of young disabled girls are sometimes overly protective, because they feel that their daughters are both female and disabled and hence doubly vulnerable. And uh, Adlakha and Ghai write about this. Now, women are also considered to be embodiments and repositories of family honor in India, and disabled women often find it harder to break out of the restriction of the family net or to be mobile, writes Lakha in 2007. And what typically happens is that the girls internalize the insecurities of their parents and families, which also leads to debilitating depression, isolation, low self esteem. And sometimes we see that they resign themselves to lives of subordination. But paradoxically, as I found in Gujarat and that Abu Habib also writes about, they are expected to fulfill all the gender duties and primarily taken to be working members of society who must participate equally in most kinds of household work, uh, which typically means indoors. So the household is the site of gender bias. Family is the agency for socialization of members to accept and transmit the bias. And as Mehrotra writes, the ideology of the descent system is a source of devaluation of women. So, when women are made invisible to the outside world, Hans and Patri point out that they are usually, invisible also to governments and movements find it easy to overlook. And so when they are invisibilized, even their rights are denied to them. With that, I'll quickly talk about sexuality, marriage, and motherhood. Now, several scholars in India write about the sexuality of disabled women, and their names are on the slide at the bottom, all those who write about them. So Adlakha and Chakravarti highlight the dilemmas faced by young disabled people as they struggle to construct their sexual identities within dominant heteronormative discourses of conjugality in the Indian context. And then what typically is seen is that the absence of role models with disabilities and negative social perceptions of disabled people prove to be the major stumbling blocks for young disabled people as they struggle to cope with both the pain and excitement of growing up in general and the personal challenges posed by disability in particular. In her incisive feminist ethnography on constructions of feminist or constructions of femininity and disability in Bengali culture, Nandini Ghosh, who is here today, raises an important issue. She uses a life cycle approach to explore the subjectivity of the disabled female body in structuring.
Please you tell Priscilla that okay for gas and all I also contribute, okay, so that I can make my food.
In structuring notions of femininity, desirability, and sexuality. So Ghosh shows how, given the material reality of the impairment, most of them learn to struggle against, accept, and manage their bodies according to gendered constructions decreed by culture. And in this way, they, in a sense, tender resistance and show individual agency against social oppression. Sandhya Limai, Professor Sandhya Limai from TIS does the same with respect to adolescent women with sensory disabilities. She writes in her chapter in Renu Adlakha's 2013 book. So women's sexuality is condemned in many societies and cultures, as we know. And traditional sexual morality basically provides spaces where women are not only kept under control, but are also denied access to resources and a life that is outside the private. So Indian culture associates the female disabled identity with a desexed or asexual identity. And as Professor Ghai writes in her book in 2015, it is well seen, for example, in the Punjabi community. Her example is from there, which forbids non-disabled girls from sharing a room with their male cousins, while allowing disabled girls to do so. Also, other scholars write about reproductive healthcare needs, and where they are concerned, disabled women are not seen as in need of information about birth control or what is possible in terms of having a sex life and children. I have also heard accounts of, cases where they have been forced to undergo sterilization surgeries by families and so are more vulnerable to reproductive health problems. Typically because they want to stop them menstruating or prevent, unwanted pregnancies resulting from sexual abuse. In many cases, disabled women are not informed about or covered under reproductive health campaigns because, as Fine and Ash write, a gender-blind approach is adopted and they are perceived as being unfeminine and asexual. And Amita Dhanda expresses this very succinctly when she writes that while non-disabled women have been oppressed by the heaping of stereotypes on them, disabled women have been oppressed because they have been excluded from the same stereotypes of being a wife and mother. Women experience thus both institutional and individual discrimination. That's something that men also experience, but rarely. However, there are also studies that show a glimmer of hope. Because disabled women are perceived as asexual and deemed unsuitable for traditional roles, many a time they have greater freedom as compared to non-disabled women, especially when it pertains to the pursuit of their careers. This is often not valued much by society, who feels this is the only way out for them, as Abu Habib writes in 1997. But this is also something that I found in the course of my own doctoral studies in Gujarat, where they actually earned or they were accorded a higher social status, and much valued actually by a society that earlier had devalued them. So when we look at marriage, as per an NSS survey, 47% of disabled men and 39% disabled women remain unmarried in India. So the difference is glaring and telling. A study by Agnihotri et al. In 2007 indicated that 1 in every 6 disabled women is likely to get married. So marriage prospects of disabled people, as we know, in our traditional system of arranged marriages, are negatively influenced by both gender and disability in traditional cultures and communities like ours, where marriage and family accord primary social status to the individual. So while men tend to be selected based on their earning capacity and capability to provide for their families, typically women are selected based on their physical appearance and ability to look after home and the marital family. So financially sound disabled men qualify to be good husbands and fathers and are valued, but our able-bodied culture undervalues disabled women as imperfect, flawed, and so on. And this is because they are considered to be unfit to fulfill the traditional roles of being wife, homemaker, and mother, and as not conforming to the stereotypes of beauty and femininity in terms of appearance. Bhambani writes about this in 2003. Thus, disabled women often find themselves accepting the cultural dictum that marriage and motherhood, which are seen to bestow a sense of purpose and identity to a woman's life, are forbidden aspirations to them. Then Nandini Ghosh, in her work that I earlier spoke about, says that feminists have critiqued the traditional roles of daughters, wives, and mothers as oppressive. But these are the very roles that women with disabilities aspire to, precisely because they are denied to them. Consequently, the feminists struggle against the oppression of the institutions of marriage, family, and childcare will be different for disabled women. As I mentioned earlier, her research uses a life cycle approach to explore the subjectivity of the disabled female body and how it structures notions of femininity, desirability, and sexuality. So, in the arranged marriage system, where dowry is, oppressive, because in the case of disabled girls, it means parents would have to give extra dowry. And Professor Mehrotra writes about this. If the girl were to marry a non-disabled boy, then more dowry would be required. But as it happens, disabled men and boys would rather marry a girl without disability than a disabled girl, thus further devaluing them. So there is oppression from both non-disabled and disabled men. And studies by Unnati and Handicap International and Laura Hershey bring these out. So they prefer to, disabled men, Adlakha says, prefer to marry non-disabled women as an act of compensation for their impairment because society equates disability with individual invalidation and social disenfranchisement. Of course, she was looking at the NCR region. Now, even when the parents do manage to get the girls married after giving a lot of dowry, writes Anita Ghai, to compensate for the defective status, the stigma of disability always looms large. And many married disabled women report that they are ignored, ill-treated, subjected to physical and mental harassment at home, divorced or abandoned. And some studies indicate that they are usually married to other disabled men, widowers, much older men, a man who cannot find a spouse for some reason, such as poverty, low income, and so on. And there are various studies by Hans Mehrotra and Guy with respect to that. The census data also indicates to us that although only 8% of disabled men are widowed, divorced, or separated, as many as 31% disabled women are in corresponding situations. And as I said, more likely to be divorced or the marriage to be annulled because of prevailing views that they do not have the stamina or fitness levels to do their domestic chores, to care for their families and children, and cannot contribute to the family's earnings. So there is, of course, a great deal more that is written about disabled women in terms of marriage, but the few who are unable to break out of the roles ascribed to them by the rigid dictates of their social context, are, they find themselves saddled with new kinds of subjugated identities. And on the other hand, non-disabled women are more likely to have the possibility of choosing between traditional and non-traditional lifestyles. So in terms of motherhood, Professor Asha Hans in 2015 addresses this issue extensively and the extreme discrimination against disabled women with regards to childbearing. While the discourse on motherhood is otherwise glorified, disabled women are generally sort of placed on the periphery of this discourse by saying that they should not have children. Society and the health system also lay down various compulsions for both disabled women and men. Both are still sometimes subject to forced sterilizations, including hysterectomies performed without medical justification. And mothers are also, that's an important point that is raised by Hans and Guy, that they are blamed for giving birth to a disabled child in the first place. And it is perceived as punishment for some wrongdoing or sins on their part. Sometimes this has been seen to result in withdrawal of support from the spouse or the marital family, and even torture. So Shubhangi Vaidya writes extensively on the lived reality of parenting and caring for children with autism in contemporary urban India in her book that she wrote in 2016, where she examines the gendered dimensions of coping and caregiving and the differential responses of mothers and fathers, siblings and grandparents, and the extended family network to this complex and often extremely challenging condition. So, my next point is that while disabled women are deemed unfit for marriage, paradoxically, studies reveal that they are considered as women enough to be sexually exploited. And sexual abuse is considered as acceptable, normal, and so unavoidable. And in fact, Mahapatra and Mahanti, in the context of Odisha in 2004, wrote that sexual exploitation is of epidemic proportions. And this can be understood because sexual abuse is less about sex and more about power. As Adlakha says in 2013, offenders do not generally violate those well-respected or equal to them. Consequently, it is not the disability per se which renders these women more vulnerable to abuse. It is the negative social perceptions and stigmatization that actually render them powerless. So not only are women with disabilities less likely to resist, but their general lack of social and economic power may also make them easy targets for abuse. In addition, Adlakha writes, need for assistance renders them vulnerable, whether it is at home or on the road or in institutions, and unable to defend themselves even in routine situations. Then again, women with developmental disabilities may be too trusting of others and hence easier to trick, bribe, or coerce, and may not understand the difference between sexual and non-sexual tactile behavior. So Adlakha also says that those with speech and hearing difficulties may have limited communication skills to report abuse. Anyway, a small survey that was conducted by USAID in 2004 in 12 districts in Odisha had found that virtually all of the disabled women and girls were beaten at home. 25% of women with with intellectual disabilities among them had been raped, and 6% of disabled women among them had been forcibly sterilized. So violence against disabled women is a silent act because the majority, say women with cerebral palsy, for example, do not even realize that they are victims. And the large demand of parents of daughters with intellectual disabilities for compulsory sterilization speaks volumes about their condition. Then again, abuse by physicians and caregivers is also common. And families of disabled girls typically refrain from taking recourse to either the police or legal systems, and these cases often go unreported. So with that, we look at quickly psychosocial disabilities. Professor Nilika Mehrotra, in her work in 2013, examined women's mental health, where she says, and I quote, any behavior of women which did not fit with the normative feminine constructs of the time was understood as illness, and efforts were made to treat it largely from a medical model, making women more vulnerable to exploitation and silencing their voices. Earlier today, Professor Nick Watson also mentioned psychological emotional disablism with respect to the work of Carol Thomas. Just wanted to flag that. So there are studies that focus on psychosocial disability, and in this category, you have the works of, it's mentioned on the slide, Davar, Dhanda, Adlakha, Mehrotra, and Nair, which have a disability studies approach and span the perspectives of the women's movement, the law, and psychiatry. Hans in 2015 discusses how extensive discrimination prevails against women with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities in the form of forced segregation, socially sanctioned abuse, and state dehumanization structures, stigma, forced sterilization, and harm by service providers, personal assistants, and even family members. Devalued and objectified, they have no rights and are treated as medical objects that are manipulated with drugs and are confined, what is called psychiatric lockup, like wild and dangerous animals. Most women who enter these mental asylums or psychiatry wards rarely find their way back home, and they are discarded and incarcerated for life. They earn the title man. Among my last 3-4 slides, one is about educational exclusion. And I've already mentioned some statistics earlier. Despite legislations and legal mandates, we find that there is extensive exclusion in terms of disabled women acquiring education. And of course, there's much data. One report on disabled women in Karnataka state indicated that the literacy rate of such women was, of disabled women was 7%, as compared to a general literacy rate of 46% in the state. And then another study by Kalyanpur says that disabled boys have higher enrollments across region, both urban and rural, and by type of schooling, that is general and special schools, than girls. The literacy rate for disabled women is about 64%, while, and these are World Bank figures, while that for disabled men is 43% in India. One problem that typically, we face in our scenario is that where a large number of girls in India drop out of the education system around puberty, what is called menarche, for reasons of safety, particularly if schools are located a distance from their homes and would require them to travel alone, or because, you can imagine what the scenario is like then for girls with disabilities who reach menarche. And because they are needed to help with household chores or income generation as well. We can discuss this later. Then again, with respect to rehabilitation programs, also globally disabled women from differing social scenarios state that these programs are appropriated by disabled men and cater to their needs. So studies by Begum, Morris, etc. Are about these. Rehabilitation services are practically not availed by most disabled women in traditional communities in rural India. But there are NGOs who are doing good work today, and I cannot claim to know, and make statements about them. But in Gujarat especially, I find that there are no NGOs exclusively working for disabled women. And there is only one NGO in Gujarat run by a disabled woman. 50 NGOs in Gujarat are run by disabled men. And the Blind Persons Association in Ahmedabad gives figures out for this. So in cultures where as such shielded from interacting with males outside the family, the question of sending daughters to access rehab services and aids and appliances does not arise many a time typically when the health worker, doctor, medical personnel or physiotherapist is a man. And census data indicate that disabled girls therefore get significantly fewer services than disabled boys and men, including rehab and healthcare, aids and appliances, vocational training, and so on. And finally, we talk about employment. Not finally, there's one more after this. Disabled women's exclusion from the labor market and mainstream paid employment is determined by factors that related to physical, social, and cultural barriers that both women and men with disabilities face. But some are particular to disabled women and occur at the intersection of gender and disability. And Mehrotra in 2013 very descriptively explores this. And she writes how women's psychosocial disability is often shaped by their socio-economic circumstances, especially in the context of a neoliberal economy. A World Bank report also writes about how 0.2% of disabled women in India earn more than rupees 2,000 a month. They are likely to be segregated into specific sectors, which are stereotypical female occupations like routine clerical and personal service work or in low-paid part-time jobs. And women with intellectual disabilities are most liable to work from home. You should, because I'm running out of time, I would suggest that you read Kalyanpur and Indumati Rao's background papers for the National Commission for Women, which talk extensively about the work and the position in terms of jobs. And they say that disabled women earn the lowest wages compared to disabled men or non-disabled women. They also talk about examples of piecework by disabled women and girls, which are typically labor-intensive and poorly paid activities like weaving, sewing, basket making, toy making, handicraft items, and so on. And they are again exploited by middlemen. And even where disabled women have jobs, their rights as workers may be overlooked. So women with disabled women workers are found to be forced to endure oppressive working conditions, faced with discrimination, little job mobility, and few skills. And this is the last point I'm going to speak about, excluding public spaces. The built environment and public transport in India also compound problems by not being inclusive at all and by deterring disabled women from moving out of their homes. I mean, where are the accessible buses and local trains and so on for wheelchair users? Especially in rural India, where the geographical terrain also sometimes does not support the use of a wheelchair, women prefer to be confined to the four walls of their home and not be seen going out at all, instead of facing bodily humiliation in a built environment that is simply not sensitive to their requirements. So I have written about this in my chapter that has been published in Lilika Mehrotra's book published last year. So while these are some slides these slides show pictures of the scholars I have spoken about so far, and they are the book covers of some of these books that I have referred to for this presentation. You see Asha Hans, Nilika Mehrotra with their respective 2 books each. Renu Adlakha's Disability Studies in India and Disability and Society, a reader. Autism and the Family in Urban India by Shubhangi Vaidya, and Nandini Ghosh is Interrogating Disability in India. And of course, you have all these books by Dr. Anita Ghai. So I have a very detailed list of references which run into 5 slides. And if anyone would like me to share the list of references later, then I can. So I'd like to end by saying that while feminist insights about gender have been useful for disability theorists, disability studies, especially in its feminist and queer and crip incarnations, promises to transform understandings of gender. In a sense, in its critique of heteronormative gender, feminist and queer disability studies crips gender, so to speak, creating an opening for the emergence of another world, which seems to be a more accommodating and democratic world. Thank you so much. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thank you so much for very illuminating talk on the entire gamut, within the gender and disability intersectional literature that is there. And it is it was very comprehensive in the sense that it started, usually what we do is we start with the objective and then go on to the subjective. But here I found it very interesting that Shilpa started with the subjective experiences, subjective realities of women with disabilities and the intersection of gender and disability and how it impacts lives of disabled people in India. And then in the later half, she looked at the objective indicators, say, of education and the barriers thereof, of employment, of the issues around accessing health, etc. Thank you so much. Without wasting time, I would like to open up the forum. There are some questions already in the chat box. I would encourage people to put your questions in the chat box itself, and I will share them, or Shilpa can read them also, and we will try to address them. If there is anyone who cannot put it in the chat box, please raise your hand and we will come back to you.
Sure.
So Shilpa, the first question is from Saksham, who is asking, can you please elaborate on the conflict between right to abortion and termination of a defective fetus, similar to female feticide?
Right. So, Saksham, that's a very powerful, and at the same time, it could be a potentially painful problem to many. I'm not an expert here, but I would say that, of course, women, a non-disabled woman carrying a fetus that she knows to be disabled, a disabled woman carrying a fetus that she knows or comes to know what you call defective of a fetus, or that is less likely to survive. It is a very, very gray area. And of course, as human rights and disability rights activists and scholars, we would protest, against terminating a life in this manner, because society typically considers that it is a life not worth living. But at the same time, in my own field work, which is fairly nascent at this stage, I have also come across very conflicting accounts several times, in which the team that the few of us who went out to conduct the study, at one point it was difficult for us to know where we were, on which side of the line. And it is a conflict that has been written about extensively, that has not been written about extensively, but which I wish more would be written about it in terms of personal accounts and in terms of lived experiences that women have gone through with respect to this question. Yeah. Radhika says, and that's a very valuable comment, that Price has used the term body-mind in order to mark the fact how mental disability matters too, but she also integrates the two experiences of the body and mind, which ultimately highlights the experiences of the body. Yes, of course. In India, mental disability clearly remains an uneasy fit or a misfit, as Garland Thompson expresses, within the paradigms of disability studies, and the research lies in the backseat too. How do we then move towards the model of inclusivity when it comes to mental disability in India? Also, do we prefer the term psychosocial or mental disability? I think, psychosocial is the term that some of the scholars, including Nilika Mehrotra, are using in their work. But of course, intellectual disability, and correct me, Nandini and Someshwar, if I err, is also the term that is in currency since the UNCRPD came into being, correct? As against the earlier terms such as mental retardation and so on.
Actually, Shilpa, psychosocial disability relates more to people who have mental illness, whereas intellectual disability refers to people who are having, who were so-called having before mental retardation. So that is the kind of difference that is being made. That mental illness is actually a psychological, but it's also caused by social factors.
Correct. So also the other thing, thank you, Nandini. And Radhika, the other thing you are asking is how do we then move towards the model of inclusivity when it comes to mental disability in India? All I can say here at this point of time is that it's only in the last couple of decades, or if we stretch it, then maybe another 5 to 10 years. Before this corpus of writing with respect to mental disability studies and what we can call as feminist disability studies and theoretical writing in India has come up. We are still to cover a fair amount of ground, with respect to several issues and themes that plague the area of disability, the domain of disability, including this one. So we of course have a lot of empirical writings which are located very clearly in the medical model and with respect to the medical establishment, including papers that are written by psychotherapists, psychiatrists, doctors and others. But there are few papers that talk about the lived experience of living with either a psychosocial or an intellectual disability. Shivani, Nandini, I'm sorry, did I misunderstand you? Did you ask me to read the questions and answer them?
Yeah, if you are comfortable, otherwise I can read it out for you.
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. It's easier for me to understand when I read than when I...
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. Shivani says at one point you said that caste, class, domicile discredit the experiences of disability for Indian women. If we do not consider such variations, do we not homogenize Indian women with disability? Can we not say that the experience of disability for Indian women differ? Yes, of course they do. And, whether it is Nilika Mehrotra's study with rural women in Haryana, whether it is the work of Nandini Ghosh herself, who is with us right now in Bengal, what I found with respect to my doctoral research in Gujarat and other locations, Anita Ghai in the NCR region, and when we read what they have to write, what we have to write about the same issues, we often come across very different findings. So it is not really, as you rightly point out, it is not, and that I also mentioned earlier, we cannot really homogenize Indian disabled women at all, because there would be a cross section of variables in addition to the ones I have mentioned, including the validating or invalidating life experiences that they may have, the kind of family and other supportives or non-supportive structures and networks they may be part of, like the neighborhood, which in Gujarat I found was often a big, network of support, including, helping the parents of a girl with disability by literally dropping by taking the disabled girl to school and back, taking turns to take her to a physiotherapy center for her physiotherapy, and so on and so forth. So can we not say that the experience of disability differ? Yes, and also enrich the discourse of disability studies. Totally, I'm totally in agreement with you. Suraj just says, oh, I'm not being able to understand what is being shown in the screen.
Can I just clarify to Suraj? Suraj, most of what was on the screen was read out by Shilpa herself. There were a few images and she provided description of the images mostly. So if you have missed anything, probably we can catch up later and share with you the presentation.
Yeah, so just to add to that, Suraj, my slides I can share. All my slides were actually very text heavy, and I consciously chose to do that so that whatever I was saying or would be there on the slide as well to the largest extent possible. The references, yes, Pooja, I'll send the list to Professor Sati and the volunteers, and they can share them with all of you. Thank you everyone for your kind remarks. And then somebody is saying, could you please share the presentation and the references? Of course, I'll share it with the center and they will share it with you.
There is a comment for Someshwar, which says that several participants are not able to join the official WhatsApp group due to exceeding numbers of participants. This is a request to do the appropriate so that we are not deprived of official announcements by the organizers.
The problem is that we had 430 registrations, and WhatsApp group only accommodate about 250 to 300 people. So what we are thinking is either we create another WhatsApp group, or as we have already done, we have sent emails to everyone individually. And by way of announcement, because of this reason, we are not going to change the link for the entire week. We'll have the same link, right?
Thank you, Someshwar, for the clarification. Thanks. Shilpa,
so most people are asking for the slides and for the references. So I'm not answering those individually. There are about at least 15-20 people.
Shilpa,
I'll share
there's
that.
a comment by Praveen K. Patel, who is talking, he's saying, I'm wondering whether there's a proper theorization of Indian disability studies for Indian women, which we could call Indian women's disability studies.
Yeah, so Praveen, I tried hard in my presentation today to focus almost entirely on Indian disability studies scholars. And it is, of course, as I said, an emerging body of studies still. And yes, we could call it Indian Women's Disability Studies, if you please. Shankara Reddy, I'm sorry, I did not understand what you are asking. Could you please articulate what you are asking? He's saying it was an insightful presentation that draws comparison between disabled men and women. Coming rights of disabled, due importance is not given to genuine rights and it is not addressed. I think there are a couple of typos here in the process of...
let me clarify it.
Gigi.
Yeah. There is a comparison drawn between disabled man and woman. Coming to rights of disabled, due importance is not given, same as feminine rights, and it was not addressed with same seriousness. Can you throw some light on it?
Are you asking that? Are you saying that this is something that I should have addressed in my presentation in terms of the rights?
Yeah. I mean, no, I'm not
that
saying
much is not written about it.
Yeah, much written about, and then much due importance is not given to disabled men rights.
Right. I think this is also something that other than Amita Dhanda, if I'm not mistaken, in a couple of papers, it has not really been addressed, but several reports by varied non-governmental organizations, that are working in the area of disability, do write about this. So I have come across over the years some reports from organizations such as Unnati, Handicap International, and also a couple of other NGOs, so, but barring that, yes, nothing much by way of theorization that I have come across.
Oh, thank you.
Could you please suggest a book that deals with theoretical accounts of the psyche being damaged by the media effects causing delusion, MBI effects causing delusion and obsessive? I'm afraid PC is asking me this question, but I'm afraid I'm not aware of such a book. Would Professor Sati or Nandini or anybody else here today be aware of that so that we can answer PC? But otherwise, if we can revert to you later, then we will do it through the center. I'll try and ask this to other colleagues working in the area.
Yeah, I have no clue. I have no clue.
Right. Professor Sati, have you come across?
Not really, not that I remember offhand.
Right. Yes, okay, Sayuja, I'll share the reference. Oh, okay. Ruchika is saying something. She says Jurjit Pal in one of his essays states that Shurpanakha was disabled through the physical mutilation that seeks to desexualize her. Do you agree with that? To call that mutilation and enforce disability? Yes, Jurjit Pal has written in his essays, and so have a few other people written about this in articles. But in a recent in a paper that I have written, which is in press and which should be out next year, I've written about ancient India and art and aesthetics in ancient India and disability as it. That's not the title, of course, and the title eludes me right now, as is typical of me at the end of a long day. But my chapter is about disability, art, and aesthetics in ancient India, loosely. Okay, and there, in one of the sections, I do speak about Shurpanakha and this and the various accounts of her physical mutilation that seek to desexualize her. And in a sense, in my argument, of course, I have taken that to be kind of enforced disability. Beauty contests, Paralympics, where physical excellence is celebrated, are they empowering disabled instances of institutional segregation with respect to beauty? Elaborate on being attracted to its practices which feminists have fought against. Yes, so this is a little, again, there is a bit of a paradox here in this question, Saksham. In the same way as, when I was speaking about marriage and how the way young disabled women perceive marriage from as what Nandini has written about and which I mentioned earlier, but seen from the focal lens of disabled women, precisely because it is denied to them that they would want to aspire to the sort of feminine constructions of their selfhood. And here again, of course, in the Western context, some scholar or two have written about hyper masculinization in terms of wheelchair sports, and also may have mentioned hyper femininization in terms of beauty contests or disabled women working as beauticians and so on. And they have been looked at as disempowering. But again, what you are asking is, can you elaborate on the tendency of disabled women being attracted towards practices which feminists have fought against? Here too, sometimes and I have actually heard about this from about 3 to 4 young women whom I interviewed a couple of years back for an outreach project, who argued and who protested and who said that because it was somebody from the team who mentioned that wouldn't this be like a taking away or a taking away of your agency? You are falling into the same stereotypical traps. And very vociferously, some of them argued and they said, but perhaps this is that one avenue that has given us some kind of agency and or has enabled my self-esteem to go up by a few notches. And when you critique that, you are actually taking away from the sense of power or agency that I feel with respect to that. So these are also very contextual and cultural specific, nuanced aspects. And I feel sometimes that by pitching our tent on one side or the other, we may be doing somebody a disservice. And then this person in our team, she said, but feminists have tried, not feminists, she didn't use that word. She said that crusaders for women's rights, I remember the Gujarati term for that. And she said they have tried so hard to bring women to a certain level, and then you are talking about going back. And as I said, 3 to 4 of them protested. Okay, what role does the popular media like OTT or social media play in countering hegemony of the normal body and patriarchy, or is it just adding insult to injury? Just to add, talking about stereotyping of bodies and the stigma attached to it. Sumit, could you elaborate on your question a little more?
Yes.
We cannot hear you, Sumit. Yeah.
Audible?
Yes, but your voice is coming and it's breaking. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, my point was that nowadays, like there are web series coming on disabled people or persons with disabilities, or the role women are shown to be playing powerful roles. That kind of a thing. Is this anything to do with actually improving or ameliorating the situation for women and disabled people as such?
Okay, let me answer your question by giving you a personal sort of example, because I teach at NID. And in fact, it was some of my students, especially the film and video department students, who came up and who told me about some of these, including Crip Camp and other documentaries. And in fact, in a disability studies module that I was taking here, I think the module was significantly enriched by some of these documentaries and short films that my students actually, found on OTT platforms and other web-based media, and it worked very, very well because what I took 2 or 3 sessions to, and each session would be a good couple of hours or probably 2 days to explain. The visual medium is powerful and it communicated much more, and resonated with my students, and generated a great deal of discussion. So everything, I mean, I would welcome these. And a lot of students, there was a discussion that was generated in the class. And I found that after we screened these films and watched them together, um, the discussions were more, were richer, were more varied, and it made a lot of students open up and talk about non-disabled students, I mean, include and a few disabled students, open up and have a discussion among themselves, which otherwise they didn't. And also some of my disabled students mentioned how this, a lot of times when they said that it also helped them, helped strengthen what they try to tell their non-disabled classmates. And they said that this worked much better. Uh, this works better because there is also sort of a greater degree of acceptance when it is coming from a medium like film. Even animated films, I feel animation is a medium that has been used extensively in the health sector, for instance, to talk about issues that otherwise the health worker may find uncomfortable. And Nandini has much more experience in this than I have, uh, by virtue of going to the field. But I have found from projects related to the health sector that NIB has taken up in the past we are 6 decades old now. And every time there has been a health related or a family planning related project, then what are typically deemed unpleasant topics or embarrassing subjects, or they have been able to deal with these and explain these in a much better way through the medium of animation. So a few years ago, as an experiment, we did that with one batch of 15 undergrad animation students. And of course, they didn't. So I basically gave an orientation to disability studies, and their departmental head also kind of mediated. And the students came up with a range of films that had to do with disability, and some of which were not very polished films, but it was amazing the sort of insights that they came up with. And many of them said that if it had been a live action, like the films, that regular films, non-animated films that we watch, they said they would have been uncomfortable dealing with it. But because some of the films also dealt with physiological aspects and so on, they said that they found the medium of animation very, very interesting. And today, animation is actually empowering several such marginalized, not just disability, but and graphic novels, for example, as well. I know I'm extending, Sumit, what you asked, but these are doing excellent work, and I wouldn't be. I am actually waiting for a time when uh, a good graphic novelist will deal sensibly and sensitively with the issue of disability. Uh, from coming up with any solution so far.
Shilpa, how much time do we have left?
I don't know. You tell me.
We have about 5 more minutes.
Shilpa, I will take 2 more questions.
Okay.
You choose the 2 questions you want to take.
There are not many. So Shilpa, this question from SB about solutions rather than talking about gray areas and problems.
Yeah, the solution lies in each one of us, and both from, I know that I'm answering this question in a manner that will sound a little idealistic, and but that is how I feel that uh, legislation, advocacy, activism, uh, writing from within academia, all of these, of course, but one of the important things, and this last week, I think we spoke about this in the session, either the first or the second session, that this has to uh, come both from within the community and without, which means all of us who are not people with disabilities, of course, need to take that agency. Uh, and I feel that many a times I do feel very strongly that, our, and as I speak as an insider to this community, uh, that our voices and what we wish to say should not be wrested from us by the non-disabled world. You know, even if we are, and I know I'm putting my neck on the line when I say that, uh, and I would probably be killed by some of my colleagues for saying that. But it is very important that even if we are unable to articulate uh, our experiences very well, even if we are unable to come up with concrete solutions in terms of articulating our experiences, even if we may be ready at a given point of time, or we may not be, and that should be our choice. So, and also in relation to gender and disability, yes, yeah, I think if I got your question. Okay, so Dharmendra is asking
I
about
think Dharmendra's question is more about political representation in the parliament.
which I don't think I am better suited to answer.
These two other questions quickly, Shilpa, from Saksham and Sameer.
Yes, let me answer. Yeah, is that sense of agency similar or different from the agency bestowed upon some women within patriarchy? So they act as gatekeepers, upholders of patriarchal values and oppression. Yes, if I get a sense of what you are saying, but Saksham, could you, what was the previous response to which this is a rejoinder? Could you elaborate on that? Because you may have raised this earlier and we may have moved with our questions. Could you quickly, Saksham? But I completely agree with you. Saksham, are you there?
Saksham, would you like to unmute yourself and talk to Dr. Das?
Dropped out.
Hello.
I think just a minute.
Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
Saksham.
Yes.
Yes,
Sorry,
you
I
are.
was in the library, so that took me a while.
Oh,
You pointed out in previous response of yours that disabled women, they feel a sense of agency when they conform to certain practices which feminists have pointed out are actually detrimental to women in general. So is that sense of agency similar to this idea that some women within a patriarchal setup are given power and agency, and then they act as gatekeepers, oppressors, and upholders of those discriminatory systems which for them themselves are in a way detrimental.
yeah, that's a
Some,
very interesting point that you have raised. And I really, really wish that someone uh, writes about this, or, uh, because nobody has, isn't that Nandini? It's
Right.
a very uh, Very, very interesting point, and probably a pointer to one of our scholars here today to take up for a research paper. It's
Actually, the
interesting to
issue
see what
is,
comes out of it.
I think
Yeah.
the issue is rather, Saksham, that we need to really target the ideologies rather than the individual women, because the women get implicated within these ideologies. Even disabled people, if you see as such, they are socialized in such a manner that they also internalize these negative attitudes, and then it's kind of a self-defeating exercise. So rather than, I mean, when we talk about usually when we talk about a feminist perspective, we talk about agency, but it is also really the need to change the ideologies that create that kind of a situation where women are forced into certain formats of agency as such.
Yes, I
Right.
completely agree
And
that they have
and
been conditioned to a certain extent
and
by
Sa-
these systems as
and
well.
Saksham also like see, increasingly we are living in a nuclear setup, okay, where both husband wives are working. So for them, I am not rationalizing what uh, a non-disabled woman might choose with regard to her pregnancy, but for them they do not have adequate support structure to probably look after a disabled child, right? There are economic consideration also.
Yes, actually, Sameer, the question, if I now can remember, is about the question about the abortion and the abortion of the disabled fetus. As disabled feminists, we are, as
Yeah.
Shilpa was saying, we are undecided about which side we want to be. Because on one side, we do support the right to choice for women. But on the other side, the choice is determined by a lot of things. And you know what Shilpa was saying, I will repeat the same thing. The moment it is discovered that the fetus will be a disabled fetus, or will give birth to a disabled child, the reactions from the medical fraternity, from the people around you, etc., are so demotivating that the choice is really not a choice then. So the choice to get rid of a fetus that is even in the fetal stage is said that it is not a life worth living. So it's those kind of complications that come in. So the right to life and the right to choose, these two are conflicting in a certain way in this kind of a situation. And then as you bring in the economic situation of the family, the location, their positionality, all these complicate the scenario. So there is no insight in that. Yeah.
True, and it is not just with respect to this issue of abortion, for example. Even in terms of a person, there's so many other issues within with that pertain to disability, where as women on the one hand, as disabled people on the other hand, we find ourselves torn between two, and these kind of dilemmas. I don't think I have very easy black or white answers to many of them. And that is also, Sameer, in a sense, the answer to your question when you're asking, what do you make out of films like Kusarish? I mean, honestly, and I stick my neck out again, but who am I to be commenting on the choice that a person in a situation like that makes, for himself or herself. And again, these are all gray areas. We cannot have, right, simple black or white answers to these. So,
One final question, Shilpa, and then we will.
Yeah, we'll start with this. There is this question from Sanskriti. She talks about reading of Janet Haley's Provocation of the Need for Us to Take a Break from Feminism. in order to understand some of the harms of carrying a brief for F, including the context of intersectional movements. Is there a way for us to think progressively about intersectionality of gender and disability and the position of disabled women in India by doing similarly, that is by taking a break from feminist methods? If yes,
Sanskriti, would you like to unmute yourself and expand on your question? Because that's a very complex question, and could we break it up and discuss it? If you are there, please unmute yourself.
Sure, Professor. Janet Haley's piece is a piece that I actually teach to my students. And what was interesting is that she argues that feminism in its certain variants operates through the structure of paranoid structuralism, where there's a predetermined end to what we want the movement to do. And she says what that sometimes leads to is that for movements where there's an intersection with caste or class or race, it leads to all questions being answered first and foregrounded from the lens of gender, and then from the lens of any other identity that we might hold. And that's where her provocation comes for us to step outside the tent of feminism. And then Brenda Kosman responds to her by saying that the tent is actually large enough to encompass what you're saying. So my question was, is there a way for us to look through the lens of any other theory than feminist jurisprudence or feminist methods in order to be able to still theorize about gender and disability? And if so, what might that entail?
Sanskriti, I think I would like to answer your question in one way, and that is that the moment we talk about, say, sexuality, for instance, and we bring in, then that sort of makes this a lot more complex, and that would be probably a way to find what you are asking, because the moment you have queer disability studies and queer disability studies, it's not, then it sort of problematizes some of the things that we speak about in what are typically called gender disability studies and so on. And it would take these discussions much further and beyond. So I mean, I haven't really read Janet Haley's work directly, but a secondary reading, of course. But I feel that, yeah, queer disability studies, in a sense, crips it, and it problematizes this whole thing about intersectionality of gender and disability and the positionality of quote unquote women within that. So,
Thank you so much, Professor.
I think that's the
Shilpa and Nandini, with your kind permission, could we draw this session to an end after a small vote of thanks by me?
Yeah.
Are there any other questions that you would like to address? Very quickly, Shilpa. You can go.
There are no more questions.
That is exactly what I was trying to say, that there are no more questions. So,
okay, so we draw this session to an end, and I would like to express my deep gratitude to Shilpa for always being there for us and generously accepting all the invitations that we throw at her. She has been very kind, both in accepting the invitations and taking great pains to explain the concepts in detail. Again, I think we had a wonderful session which opened up a lot of new spaces for everybody to think about, as the last question showed. And Nandini, a big thank you to you for moderating the session. And Shilpa and you make up a great team, and I think that there could have been no better team to handle gender and disability on the day. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to the participants as well. How could I forget them for making these sessions so lively, so engaging, with thought-provoking questions. I hope that the other days would be as engaging, as thought-provoking as today, thanks to your contribution. And I have an announcement to make that the link will remain the same, not only for tomorrow, but for all the remaining days. So don't worry about the link. Log in 5 minutes before the scheduled time, and we all hope to enriching our understanding of disability by engaging productively with each other. Thank you. Thank you so much.